Never mind what you thought happened. We know what really went down back in the hedonistic days of Rick and Teena. Starring in a game of were they really a couple or did we all just think they were? Next to Michael Jackson and Diana Ross, one of the fan-elected founding members of Ivory Soul, Teena Marie, and the king of punk funk, Rick James, had the era of Motown hooked when they released their joint track, Fire and Desire. Her identity yet to be disclosed, birthing her debut without a trace of her actual face, and when it was time for Teena to reveal herself to the masses, the folks were shocked to discover that, well, she was white. None of that mattered to Rick, who was gonna stick beside her no matter what. Little did she know, he'd also drag her along countless trials and tribulations that she wouldn't be able to escape from decades down the road. The story of one of everyone's favorite vanilla child and Rick James is a complex one. Peculiar even. Strange, wild, tumultuous, all of that. Bedazzled with a whole lot of sweet memories. When Teena Marie came bursting onto the scene in the late 70s, early 80s, no one knew exactly what to make of her. Maybe because no one actually saw her? We heard her voice before she'd ever do an actual face reveal, and that's because, well, she wasn't a fat black lady singing her face off in one of Motown's practice rooms like Rick had originally thought. But before we really get into it, let's take it all the way back to humble beginnings. Flashback. Who's that? It's a white woman. Before she went by the moniker Teena Marie, Lady T was just Christine Marie Brockert, an aspiring musician with big hair and even bigger dreams. She began auditioning for music-related ventures and screen roles as young as the age of 8. The name Teena with an I was utilized earlier on in her professional career, which would eventually morph into the Teena we know later on down the road. She appeared in an episode of The Beverly Hillbillies and continued to partake in school productions, one to which she'd be booted from after being caught red-handed smoking some of that good old Mary Jane. Word to Rick. Teena before Motown was just as confusing as Teena post-Barry. Her ethnicity and race had been a constant topic of debate even amongst her own group of friends. A childhood friend didn't even realize Teena was white until her mother picked her up from school one day. As far as style goes, Teena was in her Patrice Rushen bag, often seen sporting her signature curls in multiple plaits accessorized with beads and seashells. It didn't help that her complexion had a caramel tint to it. Think Mariah Carey, except, well, Teena wasn't even 15% Negroid, but you couldn't tell her otherwise. The only thing white about Miss Teena was her skin, according to herself, that is. After graduating high school, she auditioned for multiple record labels, but had ultimately found herself outside of Motown doors with a band in tow in 1976. Founder of Motown, Berry Gordy, was impressed with the doe-eyed girl, but as far as her band, y'all ain't got to go home, but you can't stay here. Teena, now a signed solo act, would spend the next few years recording with a variety of producers. Rickety Rick James, on the other hand, was already a semi-established Motown artist. Forming the band the Mina Birds in 1964, the ensemble was Motown's first majority white band to be signed to the label in 1966. The ensemble was Motown's first majority white band to be signed to the label in 1966, but the group failed to release any albums and disbanded by the next year. Rick was also now a solo act, producing and writing for various artists on Motown's roster. He finally debuts his solo album, Come Get It, and thanks to hits like Mary Jane, the album and Rick are a huge hit. It would be that same year of 1978 that he and Teena would cross paths unconventionally in one of the label's practice rooms, singing a demo for one of Motown's biggest artists, you know, Diana Ross. Teena was minding her business, playing a melody on the piano, when a curious Rick peeked into the room and was taken back to discover a petite redhead blowing how she was. After introducing himself, they chat for a while before Teena's manager, Winnie Martin, proposed a brilliant idea of a Rick and Teena collaboration, and for Rick to produce the majority of Teena's debut album. Tasked by Berry Gordy to produce for Diana's album, Rick waved off Diana in favor of Teena because Rick wanted to produce Diana's whole album. Since he wasn't going to be given that opportunity, then I guess Motown's New Girl would suffice. Before Rick went on to produce Teena's album, Wild and Peaceful, the two collaborated on one of their biggest hits as a duo, Fire and Desire. At the time, the critics were critiquing, and many argued that Motown had single-handedly whitened the sound of soul in the 60s. Execs were fearful that debuting a white woman singing soul would provoke backlash from Black Americans. Ironic being that Motown marketed and promoted T as a pop singer pre-Rick. During Teena's album processing, Rick had become mentor, friend, and biggest headache. The two were as tight could be and followed suit with many popular duos of that time. Wild and Peaceful, spinning with hits like I'm a Sucker for Your Love, which climbed to the top 10 of the R&B charts. Fire and Desire followed suit and would end up on Rick's next album. Word on the street was that the song was actually inspired by a secret romance brewing between the two. Teena herself stating that the song, quote-unquote, make you sleep with the enemy. An enemy he was not. A pain in the behind was more like it. A sweet pain, but a pain nevertheless. It was the Rick James Show, and during the era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, Rick remained literal to the infamous saying, all the drugs you could think of, tagged with an abundance of women, and lots of fame. Teena was in for a wild ride. What would start off as close friends would end up with Teena raising Rick's kids. Their appearances on the Soul Train Awards and other performances led everyone to believe that Rick and Teena were more than just musical collaborators. Teena's own mother being among the many who nudged T to marry Mr. Super Freak, although both never solidly confirmed ever being romantically involved. Teena did reveal that she and Rick were engaged for 2 weeks before she called it off, but insisted on Rick being the last man any mother would want their daughter to marry. Ain't gotta tell us twice. You weren't gonna tie him down. Rick may have been engaged to the music and Teena, but unlike Teena, music was the only thing Rick could stay faithful to. He was a self-destructing menace, the type to party all day and night, hold ladies hostage, and be sentenced to 2 years for alleged kidnapping and a beating accompanied by another woman that later became his wife. Needless to say, Teena was not here for the shenanigans. After leaving Motown in the early and mid-'80s, Teena and Rick's relationship as a musical duo would cease to exist in the public eye. Their friendship, however, was closer than ever. Years passed, Teena now a mother and Rick a father. Their families often intertwined, Rick referring to himself as uncle whenever he see Teena's daughter. Thanks to their union, this didn't help the ongoing conspiracy of Rick being Teena's daughter's biological father. Although both Teena and her child have denied the rumors time and time again, the people don't want to hear that. What would start off as close friends would end up with Teena raising Rick's kids. Rick's son, Rick James Jr., after Rick James Sr. had gone off the deep end following a drug-fueled episode. How does one misplace their own kids? Well, Rick Sr. didn't know. He did, however, knew he never wanted to do it again, and after Teena and company went on the hunt for the James children, Rick insisted on not being able to take both of them. Although Teena had literally just met Rick's children, she was hesitant at first. I mean, who wouldn't be? But Teena did what most wouldn't do and took in Rick James Jr., raising him as her own. Lovers? Friends? Or platonic lovers? Perhaps all of the above. Teena Marie and Rick James were a peculiar powerhouse duo that took the 80s by storm. An unconventional pairing that shared a mutual love and respect for one another. Their musical attributes were viewed by many, but their platonic love was adored by more. They'd gone under the radar for years in between since their debuts at Motown, popping up together every so often. But their relationship was way more than just some business transaction. Long live the king of punk funk and the ivory queen of soul.